Vito Bertoldo was never meant to serve in the military, or so the Army recruiters had repeatedly insisted. On no fewer than 7 occasions, they had made it clear that because of his partial blindness and overall physical condition, he was unfit for combat. When, at last, a recruiter's signature was placed on his papers, it was out of a sense of pity, and the only role offered to him was that of a kitchen worker. Bertoldo, however, was indifferent to the specific insignia stitched onto his uniform. Once enlisted, his resolve was settled. He would find a way to reach the front lines, regardless of the official designation. It was in January of 1945, in a small French village called Hatten, that Bertoldo finally seized his opportunity. The command post where he was stationed, diligently peeling potatoes, suddenly received dire news. German armored units were advancing rapidly, and the situation outside the village was rapidly deteriorating. The officers, faced with mounting urgency, ordered an immediate retreat. Yet, Bertoldo, driven by an unwavering desire to participate, pleaded to be allowed to stay behind alone, determined to act as a shield for their escape. He believed that it was better to return home in a coffin than to go back without having experienced combat at least once in his life. Without hesitation, he quickly dragged a .30 caliber machine gun into position at the entrance of the building, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Moments later, 2 German armored battalions rolled into Hatten, expecting only a scattering of fleeing Americans. Instead, they encountered a half-blind cook who had been waiting, with steadfast resolve, for this very moment to demonstrate his courage and resolve. The story of Vito Rocco Bertoldo begins long before the war reached French soil. When Pearl Harbor was attacked and America was thrust into global conflict, Bertoldo was already marching into a recruiting station in Decatur, Illinois. This was on the 8th of December, 1941. The entire nation was mobilizing, with young men lining up in droves to volunteer for service. On that frigid morning, Bertoldo arrived in the midst of this fervor, still covered in the cold dust from the previous shift, dirt lodged beneath his fingernails. With determination in his eyes, he approached the army doctor, who held up the standard eye chart for testing vision. Bertoldo strained to see the oversized letters through his thick glasses, leaning ever closer. The doctor studied him silently, then shook his head and announced, with a tone of finality, "Son, I'm sorry. You're classified as 4F. You are unfit for military service." Those words hit Bertoldo harder than the worst blow he had ever received in the mines. Around him, other young men, friends and neighbors, were being approved, shaking hands, and eagerly preparing to ship out. Bertoldo, the son of Italian immigrants born on the 1st of December, 1916, had grown up dreaming of a bright future in America, embracing the ideals of opportunity and service. Now, when the nation needed all hands on deck most desperately, he was told he was not enough to fight for his country. Desperate to find a way to serve, he pleaded with the recruiter, his voice thick with the Calabrian dialect inherited from his parents. He insisted, "I can work. I've been hauling coal since I was 16. I drive trucks. Test my strength. Test anything. Just give me a chance." But the verdict remained unchanged. "It's your eyes, son. You'd be a liability in combat." Next, the word liability burned into him as he watched the procession of recruits accepted and celebrated, while he was cast aside. Outside the recruiting office, the atmosphere of Decatur simmered with wartime energy. Factory whistles blared, signaling the start of extra shifts as the nation ramped up production for the war effort. Women hurried to take over jobs previously held by men, ascendant step by step into roles once out of reach, their presence symbolizing the collective effort of a nation at war. Everyone was doing their part, everyone except Bertoldo. For weeks, he haunted the recruiting office, seeking a way to escape his perceived limitations. He tried to enlist in the Navy, only to face rejection. The Marines also turned him away. Even the Coast Guard, with all its specialized criteria, refused him entry. Each setback reaffirmed the harsh reality. He was classified as 4F, unfit to serve. The thick lenses he relied on in the dark tunnels of the mines, which had once helped him navigate the shadowy shafts, now imprisoned him, preventing him from fulfilling his desire to fight for his country. His fellow miners, aware of his repeated refusals, began teasing him, calling him Lucky Rocky. they saw him as fortunate, an individual who had been granted a kind of free pass while they headed overseas to face danger and sacrifice. But Bertoldo understood and resented their perspective. He felt that he was denied the chance to prove himself in combat simply because of circumstances beyond his control. The weight of that rejection lingered heavily, fueling his determination to find another way. He refused to let his perceived shortcomings define his role in the war effort or his sense of patriotism. Instead, he harbored a quiet resolve, waiting patiently for an opportunity that might allow him to step into the fight, regardless of the obstacles stacked against him. Bertoldo was not driven by a desire for safety or comfort. His deepest longing was for a sense of purpose. His parents had left behind their impoverished lives in Italy, seeking new opportunities in America. For Bertoldo, this was more than just a move. It was an opportunity to honor their sacrifices and to repay the debt they had incurred by leaving everything behind to build a better life. Yet, ironically, his own body seemed to betray him right at the moment he needed strength the most. By the spring of 1942, Bertoldo had committed to memory the entire eye chart. Although he hadn't mastered it perfectly enough to pass the eye exam legitimately, he had become resourceful and inventive in his approach. Each time he attempted to get into the military, he found himself recognized at the Decatur recruiting station, prompting him to travel further and further, first by bus to Springfield, then on to Champaign, and finally to Chicago. Every journey pushed him a little closer toward his goal, but each time, his imperfect vision was exposed during the eye tests, and he had to retreat once again. As the war effort intensified, the Army's enlistment quotas increased rapidly, and casualties in the Pacific Theater grew day by day, heightening the urgency to fill ranks. Bertoldo's persistence paid off on his 8th try, when he finally encountered a recruiting sergeant who was running behind on his monthly assignments. After reviewing Bertoldo's file, the sergeant hesitated for a moment before speaking. Quote, "I can get you in, but only for limited service. That means stateside duty only, perhaps military police work or kitchen duty. That's the best I can do for you." Without a second thought, Bertoldo signed up on the spot. He had spent 6 long months fighting just for the chance to perform manual work, like peeling potatoes, for soldiers who might actually see combat. Though this role wasn't heroic or glamorous by any stretch, Private Vito Bertoldo was finally in uniform. The man who had been rejected 7 times now bore the official rank of Private Bertoldo, with the serial number 3,679,393, serving as a cook and a military policeman. At Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, he underwent basic training alongside men who would soon be storming beaches or parachuting into enemy territory. Bertoldo faced difficulties with his marksmanship. His thick glasses fogged up in the humid climate, and their shifting caused inaccuracies when he ran. Nevertheless, he refused to give up. When others grumbled about their kitchen duties, Bertoldo volunteered for extra shifts, determined to prove his worth. When the unit needed someone to stand guard in freezing rain or snow, he took double watches without complaint. Later, he would admit that, quote, "I wanted to do more than just stand guard or do the cooking, but at that moment, his service consisted of chopping onions until his eyes blurred with tears and standing sentinel at the gate." All Vito Bertoldo knew as the years 1942 turned into 1943 was that he would rather risk his life trying to serve his country than live with the regret of having done nothing. By late 1943, the tide of war had shifted into a brutal numbers game. America was suffering significant losses, and the casualty rates in Italy had begun to outpace replacement figures, making it increasingly difficult to sustain the fighting force. The anticipated invasion of France was approaching and demanded every available soldier, including those initially deemed unfit for combat roles. Recognizing the urgent need, the military administration granted Bertoldo special permission to retrain as an infantryman and to be deployed to Europe. Though he wouldn't serve exactly as a standard combat soldier, he was now classified as someone who could fight as needed, effectively bridging the gap between support roles and active combat. He was assigned to Company A, 1st Battalion, 242nd Infantry Regiment of the 42nd Infantry Division, the renowned Rainbow Division from World War I, now reformed with a mixture of fresh recruits and seasoned veterans. Officially, Bertoldo was still designated as part of the kitchen staff, but this new authorization meant he could also step into the fight if necessary. By late 1944, the 42nd Infantry Division found itself in a peculiar and somewhat tenuous position. Once celebrated as a legendary fighting force, the division had been deactivated after the First World War and hastily reassembled at the onset of the Second. Its ranks comprised inexperienced soldiers who had never seen combat firsthand, support personnel hastily trained as temporary infantry, and a handful of newly appointed officers striving to organize what was essentially a makeshift fighting unit from a collection of disparate elements. Despite these challenges, the division's soldiers prepared for the formidable tasks ahead, with Bertoldo now being part of their uncertain but determined ranks. Captain William Corson was in charge of Company A during what could only be described as a turbulent and challenging period for his unit. Amidst all the difficulties stemming from the inexperienced and improvised nature of his squads, there was one particular individual who seemed to bring him a different kind of frustration: the messman, Vito Bertoldo. Unlike others, Bertoldo did not cause trouble through drunkenness, fighting, or going AWOL, which might have been typical sources of concern. Ironically, for someone who had fought so fiercely just to earn a place in the military, Bertoldo had ended up in a role quite opposite to the combat fields he so desperately sought. Instead, he was stuck working in the kitchen, a position that typically lacked the glamour and adrenaline of frontline duty. Despite his initial determination to serve in the infantry, Bertoldo's relentless persistence was met with repeated rejections and appeals over a span of 2 years. Eventually, he managed to secure a position within an infantry division that was headed for the battlefield. But instead of proving himself in combat, his difficulties persisted, this time in the form of frequent confrontations with the company's mess sergeant. Bertoldo gained a reputation as a loudmouth, always vocally disagreeing or causing disruptions, which quickly rendered him a difficult figure for his superiors to handle. His behavior made him a constant source of irritation and inconvenience within the ranks, particularly because he was supposed to be part of the team, fulfilling his duty in a fundamental way, yet he often seemed more of a distraction. By late in the year 1944, Private First Class Bertoldo had arrived in France as part of the 52nd Division, which was then engaged in preparations for the escalating conflict. His arrival coincided with a critical moment in the war, and from his viewpoint, the timing was strikingly paradoxical. On the one hand, the situation appeared dire and uncertain, but on the other, he found himself amid a significant turning point. In December of that year, shortly after the division had made landfall, the Germans launched a fierce offensive known as Operation Nordwind, which is sometimes called the Other Battle of the Bulge. Adolf Hitler's strategic aim in this operation was to punch through the fragile American lines in the Alsace region, aiming to crush the U.S. 7th Army and potentially seize key locations such as Strasbourg. The American forces, unprepared for such a large-scale attack, hurriedly deployed to defend this sector. Among them was the 42nd Infantry Division, which was swiftly pushed into action to halt the German onslaught. Bertoldo's regiment, the 242nd Troops, was thrown into fierce combat near the villages of Hatten and Rittershofen in early January of 1945. These tiny communities lay directly in the path of the advancing German forces, making them critical battlegrounds. On the 5th of January, the German army launched a powerful assault. The attacking force consisted of seasoned divisions, notably the 25th Panzergrenadier Division and the 21st Panzer Division. These units boasted seasoned fighters who had seen intense combat on the Eastern Front and were equipped with formidable weapons such as Tiger tanks and 88mm guns. The American defenders, many of whom were engaging in their first battles, found themselves quickly overwhelmed. With limited armor support and scarce heavy artillery, the American soldiers had to resort to improvisation and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. Throughout that chaotic week, the American units faced constant upheaval. Companies and battalions were moved and reorganized rapidly, trying to plug gaps in the line. Captain Corson later recalled that their efforts during this time were akin to firefighting, likening the soldiers' attempts to hold the line to firefighters plugging gaps in a burning building. The situation became increasingly dire by the 8th of January, as elements of Bertoldo's battalion found themselves holding positions near the town of Hatten under intense pressure. Company A had established defensive positions in concrete pillboxes just outside the town, preparing for the imminent German assault. The Germans, relentless in their pursuit, started infiltrating the defenses, prompting fears that Hatten would soon fall into chaos and bloodshed. The German offensive, now in its third day, was wreaking havoc on the American defenses, turning Hatten into a nightmare landscape of destruction. Soldiers, visibly shell-shocked and exhausted, recounted stories of Tiger tanks crushing foxholes and entire squads disappearing amid relentless artillery barrages. The defenders, including members of Company A, remained in their concrete positions outside the town, anxiously awaiting the inevitable storm. Then, orders arrived from battalion headquarters. The order required that 3 soldiers from each company be assigned to guard the battalion command post located within Hatten itself, a task that was neither a punishment nor a reward, but a necessary measure under the circumstances. Captain Corson saw this as an opportunity to finally put an end to his ongoing struggles with his kitchen troubles. Reflecting on that moment later, he recalled telling the first sergeant that the cook, Vito Bertoldo, would be the one to fulfill this duty. His words echoed a sense of relief, anticipating that Bertoldo's removal from the troublesome kitchen environment would also remove some of the everyday frustrations stemming from his presence. Corson would later remember that he simply told the first sergeant, "The cook, Vito Bertoldo, is the first one on that detail." Good riddance, I thought, signaling a wish to see Bertoldo temporarily removed from his usual duties, perhaps hoping this would both help the situation and rid himself of a recurring headache. Standing watch while your unit prepared for the chaos of combat was hardly something anyone would call glamorous or heroic. It was, quite frankly, a tedious and often thankless task, but for Bertoldo, it was what destiny had handed him. Out of all the soldiers, he had been singled out by his commanding officers for being the only one considered a real discipline problem within the entire unit. His commanding officer, Corson, believed that assigning Bertoldo to night guard duty at the command post would serve as a stern reminder and possibly even a deterrent, hoping it would help him straighten up and behave. Company A had taken up defensive positions within the ancient remnants of the Maginot Line, those imposing concrete fortifications that, in the year of 1940, had failed to halt the German onslaught, and chances were high that they wouldn't stop the enemy now either. The soldiers found themselves stationed amidst the ruins of France's once formidable defensive line, eyes fixed on the distant horizon, vigilant for the first signs of German armored forces approaching. Bertoldo, showing no complaints, calmly collected his gear and prepared himself for the long night ahead. After fighting tooth and nail for 2 years, eager for frontline action, he was now being sent away from his unit, sent to stand guard just outside the town, just moments before what was expected to be a fierce battle. In Army parlance, this was often called being voluntold, a phrase that encapsulates how soldiers were often pressed into assignments they hadn't explicitly volunteered for, but were designated to undertake nonetheless. Bertoldo's fellow cooks, likely standing nearby and sharing the same fate, probably smirked quietly at his misfortune, knowing that the troublemaker was now someone else's problem. The short walk from the positions occupied by Company A to the battalion command post in the town of Hatten took less than an hour, but it felt like crossing into a world vastly different from the one Bertoldo had known. Outside the town, in the freezing cold, foxholes and concrete pillboxes dotted the battered ground, evidence of a hard-fought and failed French defense. Inside Hatten itself, narrow, winding streets stretched between centuries-old stone buildings, structures that had survived the devastation of one world war and now stood on the brink of enduring another. The battalion's instruct post was established within a solid, well-built structure near the town center. Covered tables were strewn with detailed maps, and radio operators hunched over their sets, working tirelessly to maintain communications. Nearby, officers clustered around large, transparent plastic-covered situation boards, diligently marking German positions in grease pencil, constantly updating their understanding of the enemy's movements. This command center was the vital nerve center of the battalion's defense, a strategic hub that needed to be protected at all costs. To secure the building, 9 men had been assigned, forming a protective cordon around this critical operational hub. As night fell on the 8th of January, Bertoldo took his position inside the command post, standing vigilant at the entrance. Through his glasses, he watched as faint muzzle flashes flickered in the distant darkness, signaling the enemy's presence beyond the immediate safety of their defenses. The temperature had now plummeted below freezing, making every breath mist in the cold air. Bertoldo paused briefly, drawing in a deep, steadying breath. This was the night everything was supposed to change. By 11 o'clock that evening, the quiet was shattered by the roaring sound of engines moving swiftly across the village's old stone roads. These weren't American vehicles. No, these were the deeper, more commanding roars of German tanks, panzers, advancing with deadly purpose. Their shadows cast ominous silhouettes as they traversed the outskirts of Hatten, with their commanders confident, trusting their state-of-the-art night vision equipment and the seasoned crews operating the vehicles. Meanwhile, at Company A's pillboxes, chaos erupted. German infantry had managed to infiltrate the defensive positions, unleashing a storm of destruction and confusion. Captain Corson, the commanding officer, later recounted the scene of absolute chaos. Men firing desperately at shadows flickering in the darkness, grenades exploding in the narrow tunnels connecting the pillboxes, and the harrowing screams of the wounded echoing off the concrete walls. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. Company A was being overwhelmed. They were being stormed from multiple directions, their defenses crumbling in the face of the relentless assault. Corson himself was wounded and ultimately captured along with dozens of his men, their fate intertwined with the brutal onslaught. The concrete pillboxes, intended as fortified positions, had turned into lethal traps, surrounded and systematically besieged by German assault teams eager to dismantle what remained of the defenders' resistance. Yet, uncannily, Bertoldo had no awareness of the extent of the destruction inflicted on his unit. He remained at his post, eyes fixed on the horizon, watching as German vehicles probed and tested the town's defenses. The early hours of January the 9th brought with them a new threat. The Germans launched massive artillery bombardments that shook the earth violently, reducing buildings to rubble and chaos to a new high. Their attackers had broken through the initial line of resistance. The resilience that had once defined the defenses was now shattered. Inside the command post sanctuary, the battalion staff faced an impossible choice, a moment where every decision could mean the difference between holding on or surrendering. The night's horrors were only beginning to unfold, setting the stage for a relentless confrontation that would test the limits of courage and endurance in the face of overwhelming odds. Vito Bertoldo stood at the crossroads of a critical decision: to remain and face the advancing enemy, risking capture and certain death, or to retreat while the opportunity still existed. The maps had been deliberately destroyed, set ablaze to deny the enemy any intelligence, and all radios had been prepared for sabotage, ensuring they could not be used against them. The core of the American defensive effort was on the brink of collapsing, and the entire command structure was about to abandon their positions and escape into the darkness. In such a moment, Bertoldo, merely an officer on the staff, could have simply obeyed orders to withdraw with the rest of the troops, fall back to a safer line, and live to fight another day. That, after all, had always been the soldier's instinct: survival and the hope for future combat. However, Bertoldo perceived the unfolding chaos differently. To him, this crisis was not just a moment of imminent defeat. It was a rare, fleeting chance to shift the tide, an opportunity he had yearned for during long months of frustration, rejection, and growing desperation. Instead of fleeing, he chose to stay behind, volunteering to cover the retreat, to provide a last-ditch resistance. The idea struck his comrades as reckless or even suicidal. A lone man armed with a machine gun against a formidable enemy assault force consisting of tanks and infantry. The staff officers, perhaps overwhelmed by fear or simply exhausted, might have thought he had lost his mind. Or maybe they were so desperate themselves that they were willing to accept any distraction, any confusion that might buy them precious moments to escape. What they did not realize was that Bertoldo's decision was not driven by bravado or bravishing heroism, but was the culmination of 2 years of enduring rejection, unyielding frustration, and unwavering resolve. As the battalion's officers slipped away into the shadows of night, Bertoldo hauled a heavy .30 caliber machine gun to the entrance of the command post, setting it up to face the approaching enemy. German tanks had already begun to roll into Hatten, their commanders scanning attentively for targets. Behind them, hordes of infantry soldiers, veterans hardened by combat on the Eastern Front and across Western Europe, moved in carefully coordinated formations. These soldiers belonged to the elite 25th Tank Grenadier Division and the 21st Panzer Division, units renowned for their experience and combat record, having faced the Red Army during the decisive Battle of Kursk, clashed with British forces in Normandy at Caen, and engaged American troops at Metz. To these seasoned professionals, the presence of a lone battalion command post that was clearly in the process of evacuating seemed insignificant, almost unthreatening. They certainly did not expect to encounter someone like Vito Bertoldo, standing defiantly with his machine gun. At precisely 4:30 in the morning on January the 9th, the last American footsteps faded into the darkness, leaving Bertoldo alone amidst the empty street, his weapon ready and his senses heightened. The sounds of the approaching German forces grew louder, the rumbling engines of tanks, commanding shouts in guttural German, and the metallic rattle of ammunition being rapidly loaded into weapons. Bertoldo carefully aimed the machine gun to cover the main thoroughfare and prepared himself for what was to come. The first of the German Tiger tanks rumbled past him at 5 o'clock, their legendary 88mm guns sweeping the street in search of targets. Bertoldo held his breath, blending into the shadows, waiting for the inevitable moment when he would be spotted or overlooked. He silently prayed for the tank to pass without noticing him. Behind the armor, the infantry units followed, over 40 veteran soldiers, hardened by countless battles from the brutal Eastern Front to occupied France. These Panzer Grenadiers moved in tight tactical formations, confident and well-trained. A formidable force expected to encounter little resistance in this seemingly deserted village. But they had underestimated Bertoldo. He was not just a staff officer fleeing in terror. He was a fighter, determined to make a stand. When the clock struck 5:15, Bertoldo made a decision that went against every principle of military prudence. He stepped out from the shadows, into the open street, fully exposed and vulnerable. Without hesitation, he opened fire with his machine gun at the approaching group of German soldiers, who believed the village to be abandoned or already surrendered. His weapon, firing at a rate of approximately 600 rounds per minute, unleashed a relentless barrage of death. The first burst caught a squad of soldiers exposed in the open, dropping them before they could even react or scream for help. Bertoldo shifted his aim swiftly, sweeping to the left and mowing down another group, then to the right as soldiers dove behind cover or crouched behind rubble. In merely 10 seconds, a dozen enemy combatants lay dead, their bodies torn apart by the ferocious onslaught. Every enemy soldier in Hatten quickly became aware of his position, realizing that a lone man was standing his ground in the middle of the street. The response came instantly. Gunfire erupted from 3 different directions. Rifle rounds cracked past his head, dangerous and close. An MG 42 machine gun opened up, its distinctive ripping sound filling the air as it raked the street in a deadly sweeping fire. Vehicles, including a Panzer IV tank, began to rotate their turrets and aim directly at him. Bertoldo knew that he had perhaps only a few seconds before the tank's powerful 75mm gun turned him into nothing more than a cloud of mist. Yet, he stood firm, defying all odds, refusing to retreat or surrender without a fight. He darted through the doorway of the command post just as the tank unleashed a deadly barrage. The explosion of the shell struck precisely where he had been standing moments earlier, splintering masonry and sending fragments flying in all directions, some smashing through the entrance with violent force. Without hesitation, Bertoldo quickly moved inside, his feet pounding across the debris-strewn floor. He seized the machine gun and brought it to a nearby window, immediately resuming his deadly firing at the now-provoked German infantry, who had become alert to his presence. Shortly after, at the unwelcome hour of 5:30 in the morning, 2 half-tracks rumbled around the corner. The rear doors swung open with a hiss, revealing a squad of 20 Panzer Grenadiers hurriedly dismounting, their formation tight and assuming the American fighters had already been suppressed. Believing the enemy's position was compromised, they advanced confidently toward the building. Bertoldo leaned out of the window again, fully exposed and vulnerable, and pulled his trigger in a relentless burst. In an instant, the entire group was swept down by a furious storm of bullets, forcing them to retreat. They radioed for artillery support, convinced they faced at least a reinforced squad, if not more. Bertoldo, aware of the falsehood, played along seamlessly. He moved his machine gun between different windows, modulating his rate of fire, making a single weapon seem as if it were 3 or 4. He cultivated the illusion of a formidable, well-defended position, convincing the Germans that reinforcements were present. As the morning wore on, at precisely 11 o'clock, a deadly 88mm shell finally found its mark. The projectile pierced through the window, detonating inside, and sending a shockwave that lifted Bertoldo from his feet, hurled him across the room, and slammed him into the far wall. His ears rang painfully, and dust and plaster filled his lungs, choking him. The powerful explosion tore the machine gun from its mount, sending it clattering to the floor. Despite his injuries, Bertoldo quickly strapped the weapon to a nearby table with his belt, took aim again through the broken window, and continued firing, refusing to yield. For 12 continuous hours, he maintained his savage defense of that position. When overheating threatened his machine gun, he resorted to desperate measures, urinating onto the barrel to cool it, as his water supply was too valuable to waste. Whenever enemy troops attempted to flank his position, he shifted quickly from one cover to another, keeping himself unpredictable and dangerous. When his ammunition was nearly exhausted, he switched to single shots, carefully making each round count and stretching his remaining supplies. As night fell and darkness cloaked the battlefield, the crackling of the field telephone broke the silence. The order came to evacuate and retreat to an alternate command post down the street. Without hesitation, Bertoldo volunteered to stay behind and cover the retreat, standing alone in the ruins. He remained there through the entire night, steadfast in his role, an isolated guardian, maintaining the illusion of a defended stronghold amidst chaos. In the early hours before dawn on January 10th, Bertoldo finally moved himself to the designated secondary command post. Upon arrival, the officers asked him if anyone else had made it with him. He sighed heavily and simply replied, "No one, just me." His answer dropped the room into a profound silence, as the assembled officers had expected at least a squad to have held the original position overnight. At dawn, precisely at 6 o'clock, the Germans launched their most intense assault yet on the new position. A formidable Panzer IV led the attack, accompanied by a self-propelled 88mm gun and approximately 15 Panzergrenadiers. Recognizing the threat, Bertoldo decided that the best approach was to provide covering fire from the overlooking building next to the new command post. A handful of other defenders joined him, but there was little organized coordination, each fighting their own individual battle. Bertoldo resumed his role of firing from the building's windows as he had done earlier, targeting advancing enemy infantry with relentless focus. The Panzergrenadiers shocked and scattered under his precise and sudden bursts, panic-stricken by one man's fierce resistance. Enraged by his defiance, the Germans repositioned the 88mm gun closer to the building, so close that its muzzle nearly protruded into the window. The first shot into the room produced an immense shockwave, so powerful that it knocked Bertoldo down and wounded several of his comrades. Blood streamed from his nose and ears, his glasses shattered by the blast. Through the persistent ringing in his ears, he could hear German voices, an enemy squad preparing to storm the building, closing in for an assault. Despite his wounded state and the chaos around him, Bertoldo remained determined to hold his ground against insurmountable odds, embodying the spirit of relentless resistance amid the relentless onslaught. Amidst a blinding haze of double vision, Bertoldo summoned all his remaining strength and carefully navigated his way back to his machine gun nest. As the first German soldier appeared in sight, he fired a rapid burst of bullets, a deadly round of suppressive fire that forced the entire attacking squad to retreat in hurried disarray. By the early hours of midday, the German command had committed an entire company, comprising dozens of men, aimed at crushing this seemingly small but fiercely defended position. Little did they realize, however, that their formidable opposition was essentially a one-man fortress, an indefatigable individual fighting off waves of enemies alone. Each time the Germans believed they had succeeded in silencing the machine gun's thunder, the deadly rattle would suddenly resume from a different window or opening, as Bertoldo shifted positions with remarkable cunning, ensuring his deadly fire continued uninterrupted. When his ammunition supplies began to dwindle, he meticulously switched to single shots, carefully conserving each round and making every single bullet count. Later that afternoon, at precisely 4:30 in the evening, American reinforcements finally launched a counterattack against the German forces. A relief unit from the 60th Battalion of the 79th Ground Forces Division managed to break through the enemy lines and reach the outskirts of Hatten. Hearing the unmistakable sounds of American weapons joining the fray, Bertoldo unleashed his last belt of ammunition, an unbroken, relentless torrent of gunfire, his machine gun barrel glowing ominously red from sustained firing, providing vital cover for the advancing infantrymen. As sunset drew near, and soldiers finally reached his position, they discovered Bertoldo barely conscious, still clutching his rifle, surrounded by a vast landscape of spent cartridge cases that stretched across the battlefield like a metallic sea. In the aftermath, an official investigation was immediately set into motion. Battalion intelligence officers wandered through the ruins of Hatten, meticulously counting the hundreds of shell holes and measuring the distances over which destruction had spread. They collected countless spent casings, trying to piece together the extent of the resistance. Yet, the physical evidence did not seem to add up. One man alone could not have inflicted such widespread damage and sustained such intense fighting. Despite this, witness after witness confirmed the seemingly impossible. Stories from soldiers and officers alike attested to Bertoldo's extraordinary endurance. Staff officers who had evacuated the original command post on January 9th testified that Bertoldo had remained behind alone, steadfast, and unyielding. Soldiers stationed at an alternative firing position described seeing him repeatedly thrown across rooms by powerful explosions, only for him to crawl back to his machine gun and continue firing. Even German prisoners, when questioned, spoke of a strongpoint that had decimated their attacking waves with coordinated main fire emanating from multiple positions, an almost impossible feat for a single individual. When told that this resilient defender was essentially one man, the Germans found it hard to believe. The fighting unit involved, Company A of the 1st Battalion, the 242nd Regiment, had begun with a strength of 781 men, including 33 officers and 748 enlisted personnel. By the end of the fierce conflict, after only 3 days of brutal combat, fewer than 264 soldiers were still combat effective. Bertoldo's unit, in particular, had been virtually destroyed. It had almost ceased to exist as a fighting force. The German casualties were even more staggering. 2 elite divisions, the 25th Panzergrenadier and the 21st Panzer, were rendered combat ineffective, their offensive capabilities shattered by the fierce resistance. Official reports credited Bertoldo with single-handedly eliminating at least 40 enemy soldiers, though everyone involved in the battle knew the true toll was significantly higher. The Germans simply could not recover the bodies of all their fallen across those streets, leaving many of their soldiers behind on the battlefield. Colonel Hans von Luck of the 21st Panzer Division later described the Battle of Hatten-Rittershofen as one of the most arduous and costly engagements fought on the entire Western Front, an assault that exacted a heavy toll on German forces. He noted that the division's ability to carry out offensive operations was broken, not by American armored vehicles or artillery, but by the relentless delay, confusion, and chaos inflicted by a single determined defender. Bertoldo's extraordinary two-day-two-night stand had bought precious time for American forces, allowing them to establish new defensive lines and regroup their scattered units. Other Allied units hurried to contain the breakthrough and halt the German advance. By late January, it became clear that Operation Nordwind, Adolf Hitler's final offensive in the Western Theater, had failed to achieve its objectives. The German army would thereafter cease launching major attacks in the West, marking a turning point in the campaign. News of Bertoldo's remarkable defense spread rapidly through military channels and throughout the Allied command. inspiring hope and admiration among those fighting on the front lines. His extraordinary resilience became a symbol of individual heroism amid the chaos of war, demonstrating how a single person's courage could significantly influence the course of a larger conflict. A man classified as 4F, meaning he was deemed unfit for combat due to physical or medical reasons, yet he managed to hold off an entire armored division when it was critically needed. This remarkable act of defiance and bravery, particularly in what was considered a mundane kitchen duty, ultimately played a pivotal role in saving an entire battalion's command structure from certain destruction. Back in the nation's capital, the Army's Personnel Office quietly initiated a review of current policies, prompted by this extraordinary incident. The question that quickly arose among officials was, if a cook with nearly impaired vision could perform such a feat of heroism, what flaws or gaps might exist within the existing classification system? How many other soldiers, perhaps like Bertoldo, had been unjustly rejected or dismissed under the system's criteria? News of the incident and the potential implications of its heroism traveled swiftly through the military hierarchy. Recommendations for awarding the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, rose through the chain of command with unprecedented urgency and speed. Witnesses who saw Bertoldo in action, along with sworn affidavits from fellow soldiers and officers, reinforced the narrative of an extraordinary act of individual courage. Even officers who, under normal circumstances, disagreed on many military issues found themselves in unanimous agreement about Bertoldo's exceptional valor. He had performed one of the most remarkable acts of daring and personal bravery recorded in American military history. By the time the year was drawing to a close, specifically in November of 1945, the official paperwork, including testimonies and recommendations, had reached President Harry Truman's desk. The former artillery officer, who had served in the First World War, read the documents twice, reflecting on the gravity of the heroism described. He then instructed his aide to clear his schedule for the upcoming December 18th, and additionally, he summoned General Dwight Eisenhower for a personal viewing of the case, emphasizing its significance by stating, "Get me Eisenhower. He needs to see this." On that December day, in the White House Blue Room, a space crowded with journalists, military officials, and photographers eager to capture history, the scene was tense and charged with anticipation. General Eisenhower, a towering military figure who commanded vast forces during the European campaigns, stood at attention. Photographers jostled to shoot the best possible photograph of the moment. At the center of the gathering stood Master Sergeant Vito Bertoldo, looking visibly uncomfortable in his dress uniform, his thick glasses catching the camera flashes with each movement. President Truman carefully held in his hands the official Medal of Honor citation, which he then read aloud. Master Sergeant Vito R. Bertoldo fought with extraordinary courage and valor while defending 2 command posts against a fierce assault by well-equipped infantry and armored forces. With inspiring bravery and unwavering discipline, Sergeant Bertoldo endured and repelled an attack by vastly superior enemy forces for more than 48 hours, without rest or relief, only narrowly escaping death multiple times and killing at least 40 enemy soldiers in the process. Truman paused to study the small, stocky man standing before him, noticing that Bertoldo's actions were far from impulsive. They represented a carefully planned, long-lasting operation that required not just raw bravery, but also strategic thinking and resilience. The room was filled with reporters, all eager for statements, but Bertoldo, ever humble and modest, chose his words carefully, those words destined to become part of his legacy. All I did was attempt to protect some other American soldiers. I never had the thought that I was trying to win any kind of recognition or reward. Meanwhile, Captain William Corson, who had been severely wounded in the same battle and had endured captivity in Germany, later recounted how he came upon the event. One day, he opened a newspaper and saw the president personally decorating his former kitchen problem. Corson was taken aback and remarked later, "Imagine my surprise, because the very individual he had tried to dismiss or ignore turned into one of the most decorated heroes in American history." Bertoldo's heroism was further recognized through additional awards, including the Bronze Star Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, the Purple Heart, and the French Croix de Guerre with Silver Star. Moreover, his entire battalion was awarded the coveted Distinguished Unit citation in recognition of their collective effort in defending the city of Hatten. Despite this collective honor, everyone knew that the decisive difference had been made by Bertoldo alone. Following the ceremony, Eisenhower, who had commanded millions of troops across Europe, sought a private moment with Bertoldo. Although the details of their conversation remain undocumented, eyewitnesses reported that the Supreme Commander appeared genuinely awed and deeply impressed by Bertoldo's extraordinary courage and tenacity. This quiet yet profound exchange underscored the deep respect and admiration fostered by the hero's actions, transcending mere medals and formal recognition. As Bertoldo exited the White House grounds, a journalist seized the last opportunity to pose a question, asking him what his next steps would be. Without hesitation, he responded by sharing his heartfelt intentions, expressing a desire to dedicate himself to assisting fellow veterans who, like him, had endured the hardships of service. He explained that his primary goal was to find meaningful ways to give back and support those who had sacrificed so much. He firmly believed that the most respectful way to commemorate and honor the fallen soldiers was by actively working to improve the lives of the living, those who had spent their best years in pursuit of peace, often facing unimaginable struggles. In his view, the true tribute to those who had given everything was to ensure that their sacrifices were not in vain, and that the living could find some solace and hope through collective effort and compassion.